Well, thank you, everybody. Lots of thank yous again. We're going to be talking for 60 minutes. We have two distinguished guests who will be helping us through our deliberations. But I think even before we start, it's probably worthwhile just bearing in mind the human dimension to the things we're about to discuss now. And it might be worthwhile keeping in mind those who did die, those who lost their lives, those who were injured, and indeed the relatives and friends of everybody who was affected in France and sadly yesterday in Austria. I think it's worthwhile mentioning that before we talk about any, if you like, theoretical points that may emerge. We have, as I say, a distinguished panel. We have Dr. Joseph Downing, LSE Fellow in Nationalism, where he teaches courses on global security, migration policy, and minority rights. We're joined too from Boston at the unearthly hour of 7 a.m. by Professor Jocelyne Cesari, Professor of Religion and Politics at the University of Birmingham, and Director of Research at the Edward Cadbury Centre for the Public Understanding of Religion. I should point out we were hoping to have a Muslim representative, an academic or journalist, but those we tried were sadly unable to take part. But I think we have a representative panel and views from those that have joined us. So I want to begin with you, Jocelyne, if I may. And you know, your work is, quote, the public understanding of religion. How much damage to the proper understanding of religion do outrages like yesterday's and last week's do to your work? How much of a setback is it to your work?
That's a big setback, but I would say that that's not new or unexpected. My whole work is, is to fight against this kind of setback, because as you said in your introduction, it's a very emotional, passionate topic. It is beyond analytical or objective understanding. It involves people's not only feelings, but beliefs, norms, visions of life, not only on the side of people who are either dying sadly or terribly, or the people who attack, but also on the side of people who analyze, report about it. And that's very, very challenging, because there are two sides of the story. What happened in France, in Paris, or the suburbs of Paris, or in Nice, is horrifying, and it has to be condemned, and it has been condemned, and nothing can justify this kind of killing. At the same time, the other part of the story is that the situation of religion in public space in France is a question we should ask. And I know that's not the time to ask it, because people are very sad and legitimately angry. But the question is, what is acceptable as visibility or discussion in public space about religion?
If you at this moment were advising President Macron, what kinds of statements would you be urging him to make? What kind of approach to this whole thing would you be suggesting he take?
So that's a point we as scholars have been repeating a lot, which means there are two, you need to distinguish between Islam as a religion that involves very conservative people and political Islam as a radical ideology. And I, being a scholar, I understand how difficult it is to make this distinction on the ground, because the most radical ones look also like the most pious one. I always say that most of the jihadi we know are Salafi, which is the most intolerant, not conservative as such, but very intolerant brand of Islam that tend to reject not only the other religion, but also among Muslims, people who don't follow this path of interpretation. And this Salafi happen also to be jihadi. But most of the Salafi, which means all these people who have a very conservative or rigorous interpretation of Islam, are not radicals. But you look at them, look at bin Laden, he looked like the most pious man. But most of the people who are conservative are not automatically radical. So I understand that if you are in law enforcement on the ground, this kind of distinction is very difficult to make. But it is a political act. We need to make this kind of distinction. Otherwise, we keep feeding the rage on both sides. You know, I call this the vicious circle of Islam is intolerant, so we cannot accept any expression of Islam in our secular spaces. And the intolerant and radical Muslims are recruiting on the base that some secular democracy like France are not able to accept Islam. And so there is a need politically to separate both. And I live in a country, if I allow me, where the religious conservative voices are not Muslim, actually. They come from other part of, you know, the religious landscape. And it is a sort of breathing room for Muslims in America that I do not see in most of European countries, not only France, but all across Europe.
I mean, in many ways, and certainly lots of commentators have pointed out, France is the bastion of secularism. That is the place where it really has taken root and where things like this are deeply offensive. In terms of the terminology people use, and I include my own trade as well, do you think we have the right words to describe it? You mentioned political Islam, there's Islamism, Islamist terrorism, jihadism, fundamental Islam, fundamentalism. Are we lacking a term that would satisfy everyone, if you like?
Oh yes, the terms are also a big confusing issue. So you have Muslims, right? And among Muslims, you have from nominal Muslim to very committed one. And if you are committed to your religion, there are things that engage yourself in the public space, like dress code, dietary rules, gender relations. These are issues that are not specific to Muslims. I can discuss with you all kinds of public visibility or status of religion that involve the same kind of prescriptions. So this is different from political Islam, which is the use of a certain interpretation of Islam, not the whole tradition, to mobilize people politically. And it can go through political parties, social movements, and then you have the one who go one step further, that is a radical, violent action, either nationally or internationally, like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, like Hamas or Hezbollah. But these are different. So we tend to lump everything together. And that's, as you say rightly, the challenge here, because you cannot, when you have to report, for example, on these issues, it's very hard to make this distinction. When you have to make political decisions, it's also very hard to make this distinction. So sometimes you just want to shut down either Muslim organization or Muslim figures who do not look like they are understanding or accepting the public or secular culture in which they live. And that's the issue right there.
Well, you mentioned, you know, the big organizations, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so forth. We've just had a comment from Iftikhar R1, who mentions, you know, these so-called lone wolves that are operating, who appear to be representative of no one apart from their own understanding of what constitutes Islam. And he points out that many of them have criminal backgrounds and are rarely practicing themselves. Yes. So the notion of piety for many of them has long since gone.
Absolutely. Most of the surveys we have on radical Islamists show that they come from a secular background. And that's why it's appealing to them, because then Islam is an ideology of resistance, of combat, but it is not automatically a spiritual path. And we have to be very clear here. When I hear, and that's the new discourse in France again, that Islam needs reform. Islam doesn't need reform. Most of the radicalized ideologues come from reformed trend of Islam, modern trend of Islam. What is needed is different venues and institutions where the youth, including the youth that didn't grow up Muslim, because the most radical most of the time come from come from family that were not Muslim, they are convert, and they enter Islam through a path that they think is religion, why it's an ideology. And that's the issue here. We miss in Europe venues where Muslims can learn their tradition independently of political trends that dominates Muslim majority countries, actually.
And it's part of the issue that Islam classically isn't seen just as a private religion, as a private matter, but it's a system that's applicable to all aspects of life, from, taxation to modes of dress to lending money and mortgages, to what, in a word, we classically think of as secular things.
Oh my, you are touching here on a very thorny issue. I would say, as a scholar of religion, that monotheism especially are all system of life. I mean, it is impossible as a believer, if you believe in this revealed truth, that it doesn't engage all aspects of your life. It happens that Christians, especially in Europe, it's not true from all over Christian from all over the world, they had, through the secularization process that starts after the war of religions, they have understood or confined religion more and more to private issues. But that's not the case for other religions. And being a total system doesn't mean that you have to be radical or want to take on the state. It means that you give religious dimension to lots of aspects of your life, but it doesn't mean automatically that you want to destroy the state. Actually, we have tons of surveys in Europe that show that Muslims are very happy under secular rule because they see it as a non-infringement of the state on their way of being, especially when they come from Muslim countries where that's not the case. And the fact that these Muslim countries are so controlling is not in Islam per se. It's one of the consequences of the authoritarian post-colonial states everywhere. Again, I can go on and on that, but I don't want to because it involves lots of historical landmarks that I cannot unfold here.
Just one question before I come to Joseph, and it was an article I was reading the other day by Tom Holland, and he was quoting a Muslim academic and theologian who was looking at the way the New Testament is written and what Christians will get from that and what someone might get from the Quran. And he said he was struck by that the teaching of Jesus is about example and morality and sermons, if you like, whereas in the Quran it was more laws and legal frameworks which are binding on Muslims. Is that a difference that's worth exploring or not?
It's not the whole story, because besides the Quran, you have what's called the compilation of the deeds and words of the prophets, which is like the equivalent of this vision of the prophet as a moral guide. So the two are the sources to interpret Islam. And let's be clear, the people who go directly to the Quran to justify their acts are breaking with the Islamic tradition. In the Islamic tradition, you do not take a piece of a verse and justify your action. You go through a path of interpretation that is very rational. And that's what I keep saying, that people today that think that they are acting in the name of Islam are actually doing an ideological reading based on their personal motivation, which is very modern. That's what lots of people do with their revealed text, but this is not the Islamic tradition. And to go back to your point, I can give you an example of a bachelor in theology in La Sorbonne in 1561. His thesis was, the Pope is the lieutenant of Jesus on earth, and he has domination and precedence over the king. This is what some Muslims are saying today. So you can say with your scripture a lot of things depending on the context in which you are. And that's what we keep saying. The text in itself doesn't explain everything. This is a very essentialized position. What are the people using this text? In which kind of relationship of power or historical circumstances they live in that explain their reading? And this is key, because I can do with the gospel anything I want, like today Muslims are doing with the Quran, lots of things that are not part of this century of tradition, of explanation and commentaries. And I will stop here.
Okay, no, we'll come back to you. We'll come back to you. But Joseph is waiting patiently in the wings there. And let me put to you a rather similar sort of question with France uppermost in our minds at the minute. I mean, how does Britain compare to France? I mean, for Bataclan, we had the Manchester Arena. For Samuel Paty, we had Lee Rigby. In terms of our reaction to terrorist outrages like this, how does Britain compare to France?
Well, I think this is a really interesting question. I mean, we've seen in recent weeks the closing of Muslim NGOs in France and the condemnation of many Muslim institutions as sort of vectors of radicalization, which is a very, in my opinion, outdated view of the radicalization process, that it's something that happens in institutions and in mosques that are clandestinely radicalizing young Muslims. The evidence just doesn't show that. Jocelyne made a very good point, which is the vast majority of people that engage in whatever you want to call it, Islamist, jihadist type of violence, don't come from religious backgrounds whatsoever. They are individuals from more secular families, or individuals that, as your question, the person that asked questions said, go out and commit crime. As in the British case, they often have careers as failed rappers, right? On YouTube videos, you can see that with the Beatles that joined ISIS and with some of the Charlie Hebdo attackers. So I think one problem that we have, and one trap that France and its public discourse falls into, is conflating, I'm going to use the words of a scholar, Rogers Brubaker, is conflating a category of analysis with a category of practice, right? And what I mean by that is you have a category of analysis that we're discussing here often, and which politicians and journalists discuss in very abstract terms, i.e. the Muslims, right? Or the violent Muslims, or however you want to phrase it, which to me really obscures the reality on the ground of the category of practice of the daily lived experience. So we've already had a discussion here about, does Islam dictate every aspect of daily life? Well, the truth is, from my experience conducting research in France and of living in the UK, Muslims who believe to the letter that interest is forbidden, serving alcohol, consuming alcohol is forbidden, will make compromises like we all do in our daily lives. Maybe we don't agree with Amazon, right, and its monopolization of the retail world, or whatever it might be, but they will happily make those compromises and take out mortgages or serve alcohol in their restaurants or whatever it might be. And I find this debate occurs too much in the abstract and too much removed from the daily lived experience. We've got between 6 and 7 million Muslims in France, and the numbers of terrorists or jihadists are tiny. Olivier Aouar, one of the top French scholars of political Islam, wrote a very good blog piece for the Huffington Post, where he described that there were 10 times more, or maybe even more than that, French Muslims in the French security services upholding the values of the Republic, right? So they're serving in the police force, they're serving in the army, and this is not problematic. So I think often these debates happen too much in the abstract. The difference I find with France, and the difference between the two states, is the UK, and with its issues, is a multicultural, policy-orientated country, right? So it isn't secular. It does allow you to make group-based rights claims against the state. For example, Sikhs are exempt from wearing motorcycle helmets. Whereas I see France often operating in the opposite sense, almost like a negative multiculturalism, right? So it's a secular state, but it does intervene in a great deal in many different religious affairs. And there are many different parts of the state that are really not so secular. The French army, for example, allows you to have priests and forms of religious practice within republican institutions. And I think this is one of the issues with France is that whenever it does discuss Islam, and it doesn't really discuss any other religion, right, when it talks about secularism, is it discusses it only in the negative sense.
And is part of that problem, particularly in France, and you've just written a book on French Muslims in Perspective, it's titled, that it's conflated with other things like racism, like inequality, social deprivation of those mass housing estates of Paris and Marseille.
We make a causal mistake when we discuss issues of Muslims in France, in that we often blame radicalization or violence on social conditions, right? Now, I'm not saying bad social conditions are a good thing, or that we shouldn't acknowledge that they're bad, but we have a correlational problem in that if we say that people are committing acts of violence because of social conditions, we have the unanswered question of why the vast, and I'm talking maybe 99.9% of people in those social conditions don't commit acts of violence, right? And we have an issue here of possibly securitizing and creating a security threat out of people who are in poor social conditions by conflating terrorism radicalization with the poor social conditions of the Parisian suburbs or the Marseille suburbs or the suburbs in Lyon. I don't see this explanation really holding water.
And so when President Macron or the authorities storm into some of these housing estates, possibly, or close mosques, close Islamic schools, that's really a broad brush approach that is, illegitimate in your view and doesn't work.
Well, it's not wholly illegitimate, right? I mean, there are serious security concerns in many of these poor housing estates in French cities. I spent part of my year living in Marseille, and you can buy an AK-47 Kalashnikov assault rifle for around €1,000 in one of these housing estates. I mean, this is really serious and really quite dangerous. So there are security issues, but I don't see it as being, as is often discussed, they're not, to me, they're not vectors of radicalization and terrorist insecurity. They're vectors of secular forms of insecurity, like drug dealing, organized crime, things that you get in sort of socially marginalized areas. So I think conflating the two is dangerous. And I think, again, I mean, there's such little evidence. If you look into the biographies of, for example, the Cauchy brothers that committed the Charlie Hebdo attack, were part of a group that radicalized in a park. They were not in a mosque. They were not in an Islamic organization. They were in a park in central Paris where they did keep fit exercises, right? So I do think that this notion that it's happening in institutions, and particularly in mosques, is one that's maybe possibly 15, 20 years out of date.
So again, a question I asked Jocelyne, if you were advising the president, what would you say he does? Because he's got to look as though he takes this seriously. He's got to express a kind of justifiable anger. He's got to look strong. He's got to do something. But the trouble is, you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. How does
he suffers from a significant problem here, because he is seen as a sort of lacking in that masculine statesman-like aura that people like Charles de Gaulle or Jacques Chirac had. So he's seen as weak, he's seen as unpopular, and he's also in a context where a very wise academic that I look up to, Alec Hargreaves, who wrote a lot on multiculturalism and multi-ethnic France, said that it was like the tail wagging the dog in the French system, in that people are pulled to the right by the salience and the relative electoral success of far-right parties like the Front National, which is now the Ressemblance Nationale, whatever they rebranded themselves as. So I feel he's falling a little bit into the pitfall of having an over-muscular, ineffective approach to satisfy those constituents. And I think you can have a strong approach as a head of state, but also a nuanced one. And the nuanced one is very important. But he's hamstrung by the rules of the French state. For example, we don't actually know with any certainty how many Muslims are in the army or how many Muslims are in the police force. If I was advising Macron, I would advise people to look into society and say, okay, where are French Muslims fulfilling these functions where they're upholding the rules of the Republic? But he can't say that, because he can't, in a positive sense, because of the laws, the legal framework, the political culture, identify Muslims as Muslims, right? So he's really in a very tight position in terms of public discourse.
But again, I know it's just the obvious question, what is the quantum solution? There must be a way through this beyond mere sort of macho statesmanship. Is there a way through? Should he have engaged Muslim spokespeople to address?
Possibly, but this is the thing. I don't think there is an easy silver bullet sort of quantum solution. If he engages with spokespeople, who does he engage with? There is no democratically elected single spokesperson of the French Muslim community, right? It's a very diverse community in many different ways. So doing that sort of maybe tokenistic form of representation itself is problematic. So, and I think this is something that I've picked up doing research with many different policymakers in many different areas of France, that they feel this, they're imprisoned by this terminology, right? By this context where they're not allowed to say that somebody is a Muslim unless they are an Islamist terrorist. So the public discourse, the tools that you have to navigate these complexities as a as a politician in France are very, very limited. And I think that's one thing that really does limit what he can do. I mean, you know, Operation Sentinel, which is one of the key security responses of the French state in the wake of the Bataclan attack, was to send soldiers out onto the streets of French cities, many of whom you can very clearly see are of a minority ethnic, specifically North African Muslim origin, right? Who are patrolling the streets of France overtly to protect the ideals of the Republic. And they themselves have become on numerous occasions targets for jihadist-inspired actors to attack. So, you know, he really is in a tight spot, I think, here.
And you mentioned North Africa there. How big a shadow does Algeria cast on events unfolding in France at the minute?
Not as big as some people argue, in fact. I mean, this is something, again, where I think the causal complexity of the current situation is a difficult one, because many commentators discuss, there's a book, The French Intifada by Andrew Hussey, which I'm not a huge fan of in any way, but it's a very interesting read because he charts current French jihadism as a direct lineage from the sort of Casbah of Algiers and the Algerian War of Independence. But again, causally, this to me, just the link breaks down, because many people disagree with the French colonial legacy or France's continuing involvement in theatres of war in the Middle East, North Africa, the Sahel, West Africa, but they don't go out and commit acts of violence. And this, I think, is the very important nuance that we have to hold on to, that the number of individuals that do go out and do things like behead teachers or stab people in churches are minute compared to the population of people who disagree with particular foreign policy stances, who then don't go out and commit acts of violence.
Well, let's hold on to that, certainly glimmer, more than a glimmer of optimism and hope. And if I can just return to Jocelyne now, how unified is the Islamic voice in France?
Not at all. There is no unified voice for multiple reasons. First, because there is an ongoing challenge that the French state has tried to create a unified representative body that does exist, but is not legitimate across all segment of French Muslim population. And you have a tug of war between Muslims who agree or comply by, I would say, some national or ethnic forms of Islam coming from North Africa, Turkey, or the Indian subcontinent. And all these Muslims, of course, they are Muslims, but the culture from which they come has shaped a lot of their way of dealing with the prescription. I always joke that the food, the cuisine, is a very important distinctive marker across Muslims, you know, and so they do not all come together. So this is the first big component, also manipulated by Muslim countries, Algeria, Morocco, Turkey. Turkey is a very clever state actor, and not since Erdogan. It starts with the Kemalist secular rulers. And then you have the Muslims from Europe, grown up in Europe, who do not speak any of the language of the country of origin of their parents or grandparents, who try to build an Islam that is part of their culture, citizenship, and you have remarkable Muslim thinkers among them, but they are not part of this association. I can mention a few wonderful theologians, and they have a following, but they are not part of the political discussion about representing Islam, about talking about Islam.
Because I was just wondering, you know, are there sufficiently powerful voices that are heard who belong to what we, and it might be a Western term, might call dissenters or reformers or iconoclasts or progressives, who are asking the difficult questions about Islam, but asking them as Muslim, as part of the Muslim faithful?
Oh, yes, they are. I can mention to you, and that's one example, an imam from Moroccan background called Tarek Oubrou. He's in the region of Bordeaux, and he has condemned this attack violently. He has said he has a very also articulated critique of this kind of political Islam. He has also recommended the young women who go to French school to not make the hijab a non-negotiable kind of issue with the French education system. You have lots of these people, young women also in Germany, that are doing a wonderful theological work, rereading not only the Quran, but the other sources to make sense of their way of life in this secular environment. The issue is that they are not politically visible. And this is a responsibility of Muslim organization. It's also the fact that in Europe, we tend to take the most conservative as the authentic Islam. You know, why is it that we consider in the West Saudi Arabia as representative of Islam? It is not. It's like I would make a very tiny conservative Christian group, like let's say the Amish in the US, like representative of all Christianity. Would we do that? Certainly not. So the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam is this particular doctrine that doesn't cover the whole spectrum of what is Islam. But we politically, I'm talking about the West also, have established Saudi Arabia as a very legitimate voice. And this has political consequences.
Joseph, just moving on very quickly before I bring in a rather special guest we'll hear of in a moment. I mean, how easy is it in France for an academic based critique of Islam to take place? I mean, I recall in my reporting career going to a number of sort of seminars where when we paused for coffee, you know, the Muslim academics that were invited there would say, you know, they're the only place we can actually discuss Islam, like the inerrancy of the text, what, you know, a complete text is, what infallibility means, what authority means. The only place we can legitimately discuss that as Muslims among Muslims is in the secular West, and that in Muslim countries, it's very difficult to do that. Do you think, actually, paradoxically, France offers the best sort of forum for Muslims to discuss Islam?
It offers some room that, as you say, many Muslim countries still don't have, right? Because of the, as Jocelyne said, the authoritarian nature of the state. You know, institutions like Al-Azhar in Egypt being almost controlled by the Egyptian state. But the problem that France has in terms of this intellectual openness is, we can see with the closing down of kind of Muslim NGOs in France, really is there that degree of intellectual openness when it comes to things like ethnicity and religion, right? I worked for 2 years in the CNRS in France, which is the sort of highest body of academic research. And, you know, off the record, right? The reason that I came back to the UK as a scholar was because I didn't feel free to openly investigate and discuss issues around ethnicity and religion in a French academic context. And this is something that a sentiment that's been shared with me by many scholars, Muslim and non-Muslim scholars within the French context, that see the context of this secular, and it's not just secular in terms of not recognizing religion, but also not recognizing ethnicity, right? That's also something that's technically illegal. They feel, policymakers and scholars feel extremely hamstrung in that context, where they can't talk about the issues that they want to in the ways that they want to. I'll give you an example of this. So in terms of French urban policy, right? Rather than saying there's particular communities that need particular assistance or that are suffering from specific, forms of discrimination in the job market or whatever, they do it through what scholars have called a territorial multiculturalism, in that they designate a particular area of a city, one that needs specific assistance. Okay, fine. That sounds on the surface like something that is a good thing, but it means that policymakers can't discuss openly the fact that one of the reasons this particular area has particular multi-generational issues of poverty is one about racism and discrimination, right? Racism and merging with, because I don't think race and religion are discrete in the French context, right? Something that I've written about in my book, in that the notion of being a Muslim in France takes on class, race, and gender type dimensions that are really important. But if you as a policymaker, if you as a scholar can't openly discuss these things, then there's a real issue there.
Well, that's a perfect moment to go to another distinguished guest who joins us. I don't know whether in Britain or outside. Ahmed Shaheed, Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. And if you're there, Dr. Shaheed, I'd like a reaction to what you've heard, and B, what is the nature of the problem? Is it racial? Is it cultural? Is it religious? Is it political? Where are the solutions?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Barnes, thank you very much for giving me a chance to comment. First of all, I want to say I share the shock of other speakers of the events in Vienna last night and in France in the recent weeks, and of course elsewhere as well. I've been listening to this conversation with interest, and of course, I think I think the short answer is it's a mix of everything you've said. There are, of course, elements of religious intolerance directly implicated in what's going on. There are, of course, elements of racial racism in the response, I suppose, and also there are elements of political and socioeconomic engagement as well. But I think something we often lack is the right frames, concepts, and even language to deal with this issue. As we've seen in the comment box today, what is piety in Islam? Who is a conservative? Even the term Salafi can be contested, because not all Salafis are jihadis, and the strand of Salafism which probably will reject jihadism as the way it developed. So I think there is really need to go behind the labels and look at what really happens. And one important distinction is that the focus often on the Gulf Islam and its offshoots in diaspora and the rest of the Muslim world, which can be quite different. We tend to focus on Muslims as Arabic speaking from the Gulf rather than from elsewhere where they may be very, very different. In my travels and my current UN mandate, I've come across Muslim communities hardly recognizable, I think, in some other parts of the Muslim world. Some of the Muslims in Bukhara, in Uzbekistan, and their practices would be deemed heretical by some of the Gulf states, and they wouldn't even recognize the way they perform their rites. I think one thing is to recognize the complexity of the problem, the multiplicity of causation here, and of course, one element we haven't discussed here is education. What happened? We're talking about the mosque and the violence theft and so on and so forth, but we're not looking at the curriculum, the way in which education plays a foundational role in the way young people go on and think. And within the Muslim world, there is diversity of discourses about what Islam is, what its teachings are. And you find, even today, but mostly in diaspora, are quite critical views of Orthodox Islam. And these borrow upon actual, if you like, Muslim sources from centuries back. There is scope for plurality, but we need to really engage with that. In terms of the situation in France and elsewhere, I think Muslims do struggle with secular frameworks, as there's some forms of secularity with religion per se. I think there's scope for accommodation on both sides to see that the secular context requires that that there is a certain way that we conduct ourselves, certainly in public policy, definitely. But that secular frameworks also to recognize the diversity that people bring to the community is not something that's inherently detrimental to the society. So I think the answer lies in a far more complex approach and looking behind labels to see what precisely happens on the ground. I like Professor Cesari's work some years back on empirical based work on I think Muslim extremism, looking at what Muslims actually do and say, and based upon I think large data based on again surveys that go behind labels, go behind brands, and look at what happens in practice. The lived reality, I think, is a very important thing to focus on in these discussions.
Okay, hold that for a moment, Dr. Rashid, because I actually want to bring in Iftikhar Awan, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who was one of our first callers at the beginning, and he's been sort of having a few questions in a sidebar here. So Iftikhar, if I can hand over to you and perhaps put some of your points to our guests.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, no, just making a number of points. In terms of France's reactions, and it's kind of extremism of secularism in a sense as well. That the France's secularism is an extremism in itself. So we've got a bit of a clash there. But the key point for me in terms of the terrorism is that terrorism in Islam is a relatively new phenomenon. If we go back to 60 years ago, was anyone having discussions about terrorism in Islam? No. So this is very much a modern phenomenon. And Islam 60 years ago was from the same book and the same sources as it is now. So it's not about the reform of Islam as such. It's it's what global conditions have arisen which have created this modern phenomena. And if we look back again, I'm old enough to remember 1979 when the Russians moved in Afghanistan. What happened at that point when the Americans, actually created this call to jihadism, funded then by the Saudis. And if you look at the newspapers of the 1980s and the television documentary of the 1980s, Sandy Gall's reports, these mujahideen were seen as heroes. Those are the same people which then went on to become the terrorists. So, where was this kind of terrorism created from? It wasn't created from Islam. So I think we need to understand that. And I think that there's a number of people, I think, within here who have a misunderstanding, I think, of the historical nature of Islam. And if we look at Islamic societies, traditionally they have been pluralistic. That's why we have minorities living throughout the Muslim world. In fact, in India, the Muslims were a minority, although they were ruling the majority, and the majority still had their faith.
Okay, well, just put that back to Jocelyne, if you like, and perhaps mention that thing that you mentioned right at the beginning, Iftikhar, which is that secularism is almost a religion in France as well. That, if you like, secularism is a form of intolerance view. Yes. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there are different, indeed, ways of dealing with this relationship between religion and politics. Ideally, what secular culture should be is a sort of neutrality on both sides, meaning the state not interfering on religion, but also religious groups committed to not taking the state action or domain for their own purpose. But you have a culture that specifically in Europe, and it's beyond France, see religion as illegitimate in the public space. We all grew up in France and even beyond France with this idea that religion in public space is trouble. And I think heavy in our psyche through centuries of socialization is a war of religion. If you talk to the French today, they will tell you the same kind of threat or anxiety about the fact that if you put religion too much or let it go too much in public space, people are going to kill each other. And this doesn't start with Islam. You can go back to the war between Catholic and Protestants. So this is the psyche. And based on that, the French had implemented one of the most restrictive conception of the public space, which is the ideal of a secular space devoid from religion, meaning we don't want to see it. It doesn't belong here. And this is very extreme. No European country had gone to this level of pushing religion out of the public space. And this is absolutely going now with indeed a sort of religious commitment to this extremist conception of a secular space, which is an empty space, empty of religion, which is impossible, inhuman, actually, on any believers. We are talking about the Muslim, but it's heavy on the shoulder of any religious citizen today. I remember when the 2004 law prohibiting religious signs in public school was adopted, suddenly you have the Sikhs saying, and what do we do? And the French saying, sorry, you cannot even wear the turban in the public school. That's a kind of, heavy prescription that is untenable if you are a religious citizen. And in this sense, it's absolutely true that it becomes a religion. If people are committed to it, they want to fight about it, and no discussion is allowed about that. Yes.
Now, Joseph, you've studied France in depth, and you're currently working as a British academic in Britain. So do you think we've got the balance right? Not wanting to tap ourselves on the back, but do you think we've got the kind of balance between secularism, freedom of religion, freedom of expression about right?
Wow, what a tough question. I mean, I don't know. Do we have it right? I mean, it seems to me that there are other forms of cultural expression in the UK that we don't deem as so legitimate. I think we have a deeply class-based society, which is extremely problematic in many ways in terms of marginalizing both, working class English and also working class Afro-Caribbean or, Asian forms of culture and forms of behavior in many different ways. I don't think we should see Britain as this utopia where there aren't problems that exist. We can see significant discrimination still taking place in the labor force in terms of access to health and housing. So I don't think necessarily structurally, right, we can look and pat ourselves on the back. I think where we do have some strengths is that we have a vocabulary and a terminology of plurality in the public sphere that we openly acknowledge. Building on what Jocelyne said about the banning of religious symbols in French schools, one example from that is very interesting to me is that it didn't ban small crosses in the public sphere. So you shouldn't actually, in my opinion, you shouldn't necessarily just categorize France as a secular space or about secular politics, but as many French scholars have said, that it's a Catholic-laïcité, i.e. a Catholic form of secularism. For example, school holidays still occur around Easter and Christmas, right? So even within something that we see from the outside of secularism, outside of secular, there's certain forms of biases. And as I said, it's almost like a negative multiculturalism where France will engage, if the French state will engage with minority religions, but in a negative sense. And I think one thing that we have in the UK that we don't always, that we also can get very wrong is at least we have the tools in the public domain to have a discussion that's beyond just a negative discussion about minority religions.
Okay, we're coming to a close now. Can I just ask you to solve a conundrum of mine on a personal level? Let me just tell you a story. I've got a friend, the best friend, I had known him for 50 years. We were at school together. After graduation, he became a teacher. Then he became a head teacher. He married a teacher, and he has 3 daughters who themselves are teachers. A dynasty of teachers. Now, I don't know whether, and I'm pretty sure they didn't, either of the young women who I've known since they were born taught RE or civics, but if they'd come up to me and said, I'm thinking of giving a lesson on the cartoons of the Prophet and showing some of these to my pupils, what do you think? This is my conundrum. I would say, don't do it. Just don't do it. But the conundrum is that me being respectful of somebody else's feelings? Is that me simply being prudent? Or is it me running scared and accepting a blasphemy law, down the barrel of a gun? Jocelyne.
I would say that the cartoons by themselves are problematic, meaning in the sense that you can make fun of religious acts, but there is a limit to which, how do you deal with mockery without turning into insult? And this is a real problem for any religious group. I remember, and there was a publicity board by Dolce Gabbana, the Italian designer, that was making fun of the Last Supper of Christ. And it was all over the French cities. The Catholic Church felt offended. So these are the kind of things that will happen all the time. So what do we do if we teach? And I am a teacher, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is right to talk about it. I'm not sure it's right to show them with all the emotional and contradictory feeling around it. And I'm not even sure that it does help freedom of speech. What's the use of showing them? We know what it's about. It's like a few years back, there was a terrible, I don't even want to call this film, about called The Innocence of Muslims. That was a sort of deprecatory description of the life of the Prophet Muhammad. You can talk about it. What is to show? There is nothing in there that really makes you advance the debate. And you can also discuss that in Islam, unlike what people think, there is also a tradition of representing prophets. You have, but that's the kind of discussion you can have without having to show the cartoons in themselves. So I would show them out of respect, but not automatically out of fear, but really out of respect for the people who feel that this is not the right way to engage in a discussion on freedom of speech.
And your thoughts on that, Joseph?
I mean, it's as you delivered on your promise of a very, very, very difficult question that gets even more difficult, right? And it's worth also remembering that, the teacher in the suburbs of Paris showed these cartoons for several years. It wasn't just, that he was murdered on the first sort of lesson, right, of showing these things. So there is something about a degree of tolerance by local Muslims in the suburbs of Paris, right? So it isn't just that he showed the cartoons and he was killed. The murderer came from a different part of France. Like, it's a very complex issue, this attack, that I think we need to consider. Yeah, it's a very difficult one. I mean, should you be governed by fear in terms of being an educator? I don't think so, personally. Is it a sensitive way to address this particular question? I don't think so either, right? If I was to plan that lesson, I would structure a discussion of the cartoons without possibly showing them, right? So that's the way that I would sidestep it. I don't think we should have taboos, but the issue with freedom of speech, and when we look at freedom of speech and questions of ethnicity and religion, we do have taboos, actually, right? Both in France and the UK, we have laws around, and I'm not condoning it and I'm not equivocating the two issues, but it's worth considering that we do have rules around hate speech. We do have rules around Holocaust denial. We do have rules around a number of different issues, right, relating to these kinds of issues that, demonstrate that it is something that states don't just take a freedom of speech approach to, right? So that's how I would, if I was to be that teacher, I would do the lesson on religious depictions without necessarily showing the cartoon. We've got an interesting question here that's just come in this chat: tolerance by local Muslims or forced tolerance by state repression? Well, I think we're talking here about death and we're talking here about murder, and I think it's important to consider that the vast, and I'm not quoting these statistics out of thin air. This is the empirical truth. My book is about the banalization of the French Muslim experience, and not looking at it as a problem and just looking at the extreme problematic voices, but looking at the fact that 99% of these 6 to 7 million people do not condone violence, regardless of how deeply they disagree with something. They don't agree that people should be killed for it. And that is a fundamental teaching in the Islamic religion, that there is a taboo on the killing of people. I mean, this is not, I think, up for debate here.
Okay, I think that is an appropriate comment on which to end this. I'm looking at the clock, as the late Humphrey Lyttelton would have said on his program on Radio 4, the arrow of time has hit the bullseye of destiny. And it's time to thank you all for listening. Thank you, Joseph Downing. Thank you, Jocelyne Cesari. Thank you to Ahmed Shaheed. And thank you all from listening.